Welcome back here, Jock 98.7. Pleased to be joined on the guest line by Andy Strickland, rinkside reporter for Fox Sports Midwest. He's a host on 590 The Fan, KFNS in St. Louis, and also the co-host of the Cam and Strick podcast, which has just been blowing up, and we're grateful for his time this morning. Strick, how are you, partner?
Great to be with you, Nate. I'm the Jock 98.7. Always good to hear your voice.
It is funny, a difference of the year, right? I mean, yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of Game One of the Blues and Bruins Stanley Cup Finals, and also yesterday Gary Bettman coming out and sort of leading the charge for the NHL implementing their return.
Yeah, and so I mean, listen, it's positive news. It's a move in the right direction, and I think a lot of people can certainly be encouraged by what they're hearing from the National Hockey League and the fact that the players would agree to, the format. Different situation than what you're seeing right now in baseball because, baseball, listen, it comes down to money. Revenues need to be split. Players haven't been paid. The NHL has the advantage because they played 85% of their season. Players got paid their entire salary except for holding on to their final paycheck. They're still deciding what they want to do with that, if they want to put it towards escrow or what they want to do with it. But, it's not a situation of NHL players wanting to come back and play. I think players understand that they have no choice. They have to come back and play just for the security and the health of the game moving forward beyond this season. I don't think players are excited about going to a hub city. There's a lot of unknown about going to a hub city. What is the situation going to be like? Although it's the National Hockey League, Nate, and you know this, man, they're going to have just a sick setup for these players. And I think they realize that. I think early on there was some apprehension in terms of being quarantined in a different city. But listen, they're going to roll out the red carpet for these players and make it as accommodating as possible. But, the fact that the players would go along with it, they've agreed with the 2014 format with the play-in round, and then getting down to a 16 playoff format, a traditional 16 team format, is great. And now it gets down to real negotiating and making sure the players are satisfied with the potential health concerns and safety concerns, and trying to button up some details in terms of how this playoff would operate. And then I think we're going to see hockey, and it may be a few more weeks before we see it. I know Gary Bettman said training camps wouldn't open up until the middle of July at the earliest. But based off of the way the last couple of months have gone in this country and for sports fans, I know hockey fans will certainly take it.
And the NHL and Gary Bettman, I think a lot of times are looked at as sort of lagging behind the other three, whether it's Major League Baseball, NFL, NBA, in terms of making decisions. And to see Gary Bettman out there on the forefront and making these decisions, I just feel like it's really reassuring for hockey fans that they don't have to be, they're not letting someone else be the guinea pig. They're going to take the charge and go forward with this.
I would agree. Listen, Gary Bettman deserves a lot of credit. First of all, he's the one who personally came up with the term pause, which I thought was brilliant
Hmm.
because I think it created a level of calm for the fan base to know that, okay, they're just taking a pause. The season will return. It's going to come back. I mean, that's been the approach for the National Hockey League, and they haven't hidden from that. They've been very transparent in terms of what their plans are to bring hockey back this summer. They also had the advantage of having some runway, of being willing to start next season, which it won't start before the month of December, so they can push that back to December as long as hockey comes back this summer, and possibly even into January. You could have the first NHL game next season be January 1st, the Winter Classic in Minnesota between the Wild and the Blues, which would be pretty interesting for Blues fans here in St. Louis, and certainly a big stage for the NHL to play their first game involving St. Louis of the season and play it outdoors in Minnesota. That'd be pretty cool. But I give Gary Bettman a lot of credit. I totally agree with you. Now, again, like I said, he has the advantage where it hasn't had to be a knockout, drag out fight with the Players Association because they did get in 85% of the season, like I said, and players got paid. It's a completely different situation than baseball. If NHL players hadn't gotten paid, and all of a sudden you had owners coming out and basically just trying to slash salaries at the same level that we're seeing right now from Major League Baseball and their owners, I think you'd see a little more tension. But I think players understand, like I said, they really have no choice. I mean, guys, Listen, they've been golfing all the time, Nate, throughout this pause. Golf courses have been open here in Missouri. Guys have been golfing around the league. This is their off time. We're getting into the summer. I mean, if you really, had to talk to players, I don't think they really necessarily want to come back and play in the summer, but they realize they have no choice. And the fact that they're doing this for the good of the game and to assure that they can make the money they've been making moving forward into the future and keep the game healthy, I think says a lot about where we are right now between the NHL and the Players Association and their relations. I don't think it's been as healthy as it is now for quite some time.
So 24 teams will get into or continue action here. And really, whatever they decided to do was probably going to take heat, right? There's not enough teams. There's too many teams, this, that, and the other. Everyone's going to have an opinion about something. But I think that this format will allow for teams that were on the bubble to sneak in there and make some headlines. And I think for teams like the Blues, who are leading their conference with still some big games to go with 2 weeks left, I think they're set up with an opportunity to at least garner some advantage with what their seeding will be.
You'd think so. And again, that's one topic that they're negotiating right now. Do they reseed after the play-in round? And my gut tells me that they will. Talking to Colton Parayko, who's the player rep, and, different players around the league, I think that's what they want to see. This is not a traditional season, as we know, or a traditional playoff, so you can't treat it as such. So the traditional bracket format may need to be thrown out the window for this season and reseed, especially when you have a 12 versus 5 playing in a play-in round. I mean, what happens if Chicago upsets the Edmonton Oilers and all of a sudden they're the lowest seed heading into the playoff as the 12? I think the number 1 seed should face the lowest seed and then continue to reseed after each round. I think most people are in agreement with that. But I think it's going to be fascinating. I mean, listen, hockey with no fans, this is completely new territory. Obviously, nobody has ever been through something like this. But I think this is what creates some excitement and makes it fascinating heading into the summer. What hockey is going to look like? What are the broadcasts going to look like? How much virtual advertising and virtual signage and different virtual elements are they going to implement or throughout the broadcast to make it entertaining for fans? Are they going to pipe in fake crowd noise? Are we going to be able to hear the players chirping each other on the ice? What rules are going to come into play to try to make the game and the players as safe as possible? I mean, all those things, at least for me, and I know I'm a hockey fan, but I know a lot of people listening are hockey fans as well. This is what makes it interesting because it is so different. And I think from that standpoint, it's going to get a lot of attention and people are going to be locked in and want to watch.
Are you surprised that St. Louis is not listed as one of the finalists for being considered as a hub city?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I know they wanted it and they, officially applied to bring a hub city to St. Louis. Now, if they were going to go the 4-city route, um, there's a chance that maybe St. Louis would have been included. And some people would say, well, it doesn't make sense because they're not even in the final list. And I realize that. But we're talking about the cities that are left are cities that are capable of hubbing 12 teams, versus 6 or 7. So it's a little bit of a different situation. I mean, people were kind of freaking out around here, Nate, being like, "Oh my God, how could they do this to St. Louis?" Listen, it's going to be okay. I mean, St. Louis has had great success hosting league events over the years. From the Winter Classic to the All-Star Game to the Stanley Cup Final. And, they've gotten great feedback, and the league has been, head over heels with the way, they've hosted events and the way they've renovated the Enterprise Center. And, I mean, so you had ice and different things that you needed. Um, for whatever reason, they chose not to, but you weren't going to be able to go to the games anyway. And you weren't going to be able to go watch them practice. So it's not like fans in St. Louis are missing out. There may have been a little bit of an economic boost here in the city because you have all these teams here. And that would have been nice for the city. But in reality, I don't look at it as a slap in the face or any type of slight to the city of St. Louis because the NHL is choosing to go in a different direction. The league confirmed with me, Nate, on multiple occasions that St. Louis was being considered. I've got Bill Daly from the NHL coming on my radio show tomorrow. I do a weekly hockey show here in St. Louis called Hockey Sense. And I'll ask him tomorrow just to get it off and get it out there. So Blues fans and St. Louis fans who have a little bit of that complex, as we know, so they can just turn the page and move on and maybe get the answer directly from the horse's mouth there with the National Hockey League. So we'll see what he has to say tomorrow.
I do think that a lot of it just goes back to the pride that St. Louisans have for their hometown, and after
Hmm.
they were publicly ripped with the Rams leaving, I think there's a constant necessity to defend why St. Louis
Yeah.
should not be overlooked, and I get where they're coming from, even if it's a bit much.
Hmm.
A question for you in regard to these games: are we looking at a scenario where the NHL Strick are going to be playing, upwards of 6, 7 games a day?
Absolutely. And there's a good chance we're going to see back-to-back games in the playoffs where your team may play 2 days in a row. Now, as you get deeper into the playoffs, I'm not exactly sure if they'll do that or not, but I have been told by people with the league that they want to complete this entire event from the first game of the play-in round to the final game of the Stanley Cup final. They want to complete that within 60 days. So they have the ability to play back-to-backs with no travel involved, with every team being in the same city, even though they haven't exactly announced where their cities are going to be and how they're going to handle the conference final and the Stanley Cup final, where those games are going to be played. Is there any chance whatsoever that the Stanley Cup final could be played in the city of the teams that are involved in the final round fighting for a Stanley Cup? I mean, those are something that I think people are interested in, and there is a possibility, although Gary Bettman has said as it sits right now, they would most likely stay in the two hub cities or pick one hub city um, out of the two for the last round of the playoffs. So we'll see how that plays out. But so I mean that makes it relatively exciting. The whole thing is going to be just so new, Nate. From that standpoint, it's just going to be um, extremely interesting just in terms of how it plays out, and especially like you said, if St. Louis, if the NHL is the first league to come back, if basketball were to come back first or baseball were to come back first, you can kind of get an idea of what things will look like. I mean, if the NHL is the first league to do it here in North America, and I know we've seen soccer teams over in Europe and obviously some baseball in Korea. I mean, this would be completely different, and so they're kind of the guinea pig at the same time, and how they do it would be really interesting. But one thing the NHL knows how to do is pull off events. They've been super successful in doing that over the years, and I would imagine they'll be really good at it once again this year.
A few more for Andy Strickland, who is our guest here on Jock 98.7. Ramifications from all of this. The draft in particular, and then next season, as you sort of alluded to, that when they drop the puck for faceoff week, it could start with the Blues Wild outdoor game. So how would that affect subsequent seasons moving forward?
That's a good question. And, how late do they want to take 2021? If they start in December and January, what does that mean? Is the Stanley Cup final in July? Is it in August? Can they finish it in early July? Can they finish it in time to begin the 21-22 season on time with the September training camp and a regular season that begins in October? Um, do they look at this, Nate, and say, wow, this may be the best for the National Hockey League to start the season in December, where you're not going up against the National Football League for the first couple months of the season. You're not going up against postseason baseball. You're not going up against some of the other sports that obviously attract major TV numbers. And there could be more dollars available also if you change your schedule. There's been people around the NHL who have suggested the league do this for quite some time anyway. So they may go through this and say, wow, maybe this is the direction the NHL needs to go into, permanently. Um, so, I mean, again, those are things that I think they're still trying to figure out. They don't want to make any firm announcements in terms of how they're going to play this out moving forward because I don't think they want to get themselves locked into any one scenario. But this is where it's going to be really interesting. Now, I mean, there's a chance that the season starts in December too. I mean, you could have a December training camp, take Christmas off, and then start right after that, play a game or two before you get to the Winter Classic, or could they could just start it off on national TV with the Winter Classic? I think these are all ideas that the NHL is discussing internally, but they certainly haven't made any decisions on that quite yet.
Do you think St. Louis, this is maybe one of the highs that they've ridden as far as hockey goes and being respected? They've got several players that call St. Louis home right now as premier stars in the league. The fact that the Blues won the Stanley Cup, like it just seems to be a pretty good time to be a hockey fan and know that St. Louis is being respected around the league.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you win the Stanley Cup, especially for the first time in their history. I mean, that's just, it's a game changer. You knew it would be a game changer, not only in terms of, where the NHL's or the Blues stack up across the board in the National Hockey League, but what it would do for the popularity of the game here locally in the state and in St. Louis specifically. I mean, you see kids everywhere, Nate, man, they're wearing Blues hats. They've got the hoodies, they got the T-shirts, the jerseys. I see way more kids wearing blue stuff than Cardinal stuff, and I mean, that wasn't always the case, but it definitely is the case now. And it would be, with the Blues winning the Stanley Cup, you could make the argument the Blues are the most popular team here in St. Louis. And I know a lot of purists and a lot of old school fans are going to be like, oh, there's no way that's the case because of the Cardinals being as popular as they have been. Listen, I'll give it to you. The Cardinals obviously are the standard here in St. Louis, but baseball across the board, and that's why they need to be careful here, isn't as popular throughout the country as it is here in St. Louis. And I know, hockey's always been considered regional as well. But here in St. Louis specifically right now, man, I mean, hockey has just absolutely taken off. I think the Blues have always been respected because they've had so many good players. I mean, you look at the history of the organization, Nate, and how many Hall of Fame players have come through St. Louis at one time or another. How many great teams they've had who were so competitive with great players and great coaches who just could never get over the hump. There was always somebody else that was better. And that was what was different about last year. And I really thought this heading into the playoffs last year. There was no Colorado. There was no Detroit. There was no Dallas. There was no Chicago or LA in recent years who the Blues just couldn't get past because they weren't as good as them. Or the Detroits back in the 90s and early 2000s. I mean, you didn't have that. I didn't think there were any real great teams or powerhouses in the National Hockey League heading into last season and heading into this season. I think the salary cap has a lot to do with that. It maybe creates a little more of a level, even playing field, but at the same time, maybe you don't have those dynasties that are in your way, and maybe the Blues are going to become one because the Blues certainly are head and shoulders above most teams in the conference, and they're right there with the dominating teams throughout the National Hockey League. They got good players. They've got the two-headed monster, I like to call it, between Doug Armstrong and Craig Berube, just in terms of how they stabilize this organization along with the owner, but they have full control over this organization. They are in full control. You can't say that about most teams, Nate, and this is why if the NHL returns and they play, and they've got a lot of hurdles they still need to get over, but I do believe that they are going to play. I don't worry about the Blues being prepared, being ready, being interested. Um, they have no choice when Craig Berube's your coach and Doug Armstrong's your GM. They will have these guys completely locked in. And with the veteran team that they have, man, you know this, once they get to Vegas or wherever they end up going and the puck drops, they're going to be in it to win it. And I'm going to be really interested to see how well they can defend the Stanley Cup, even though people don't look at it the same as it has been in the past and they want to put an asterisk by it or whatever. Hey, that's fine. Like to each their own in terms of how they want to look at it, because it isn't the same as what we've seen throughout the NHL's history. But it's still going to be a tournament, and it's still going to have 16 pretty damn good teams. You're still going to see the top teams advance and rise to the top as we move on through the Stanley Cup playoffs. I still think the Boston Bruins and the Capitals and Vegas and Colorado and St. Louis, I mean, those teams are still going to be good. That's not going to change. And you're going to have to beat some pretty good teams if you want to win the Stanley Cup even this year.
I am glad that it wouldn't be the Blues' first Stanley Cup in this format,
Yeah,
but I'll tell you
yeah.
what, I have no qualms about spending another summer with Lord Stanley. That's for damn sure.
I don't know how that's going to work, man. I mean, are they going to be able to have a parade? Are you going to be able to drink out of the cup? Can you kiss the cup? Can you touch the cup? I mean, I don't know what it's going to be like, obviously, with everything going on, man. I mean, seriously, it's going to be really different. So, I'm with you. At least this isn't the first one. And if they don't win it, call me back and I'll tell you it doesn't matter.
Exactly. Hey, how much fun have you guys had on with Cam Jansen on the Cam and Strick podcast? It's blowing up. If you look at the Apple podcast charts, you guys are really picking up some steam, and I'll tell you, it just seems like a very natural setting.
Dude, it's so much fun. I mean, Cam is great. Cam, he's just total personality. He's exactly who you hear. on the podcast and who you see. I mean, that's him all the time. And so, we've lucked out from that standpoint. I think he and I have great chemistry. We get along really well away from the podcast. We're friends. We have a great dynamic in terms of what our roles are on the podcast while we're recording and when we're not recording, and what we want to accomplish, and how driven and competitive both of us are, and how much we love the game and love the history of the game, and talking to people and hearing stories and trying to get um, stories that you're not going to hear in a traditional media format, or that you've never heard before, from some of the greatest names to ever play. I think in a podcast, I mean, you got to be entertaining, you got to have original content. That certainly is part of it. And you want to create content that is different than what you're going to hear on traditional media, which I didn't know a ton about podcasts. I mean, I was familiar with what they are, and I had listened to some podcasts, but I wasn't one of those guys that sat around and listened to a ton of them. So I was interested to see how this goes. But, kind of the uncensored, raw content that you're able to do on a podcast, I think is attractive to a lot of people. And it's fun to do. And when you get people who can come on in that format and just cut loose with people who they're comfortable talking to, and we try to do our best to make them comfortable. Um, it's just been a great situation. I don't think either of us could have imagined that it would have taken off as quickly as it has. We still have a lot of room to grow, and we want to take this thing to even a higher level, a couple higher levels. Uh, but based on the way it's gone in less than a full calendar year, we couldn't ask for anything more. We're having fun, and we appreciate everybody who's gone out there to listen. So you can check it out. Cam and Strick Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever you get your podcast. And we've got Twitter accounts at Cam and Strick Pod, Instagram at Cam and Strick Pod. You can follow Cam Jansen at Cam Jansen25. I'm at Andy Strickland on Twitter, at Real Strick Nasty on Instagram. So, I mean, there's ways to follow us and get all the content, because we put out content between the episodes that are released every Tuesday and Friday as well. So appreciate the support, Nate.
Hey, anytime. We appreciate you hopping on with us, and we know you're a busy man. When news breaks around the game of hockey, you're a wanted man. So anytime we can get from you is greatly appreciated, man.
All right, anytime, brother. You know that.
Andy Strickland joining us on JOCK 98.7. We'll be back after this timeout.